The chandelier above the auction block dripped wax onto the stone, and Mara counted the drops to keep from screaming. 3 days. It had been 3 days since she last ate, and the hunger had become a creature of its own, curled behind her ribs, gnawing. The rope around her wrists had rubbed the skin to weeping. She stood on the raised platform in the great hall of House Vane, barefoot on cold marble, while the lords and ladies of the western packs drank from goblets of moonstone glass, and looked at her the way one looks at furniture that has begun to rot. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice like a wet hinge, gestured at her with his cane. A wolfless girl, he announced to the gathered court. No pack, no mate, no value beyond her hands. He listed her uses as one might list the uses of a mule. She could scrub, she could carry. She could be made to be quiet. The crowd laughed, and the laughter moved through the hall like wind through tall grass, and Mara fixed her eyes on a single point on the far wall. A chip in the black iron sconce, and she did not let her face move. Quiet dignity. It was the only thing she still owned, and her aunt had not been able to sell it, though Goddess knew the woman had tried. Aunt Sereth stood near the front of the crowd in a gown the color of dried blood, her chin lifted, her smile small and satisfied. She had raised Mara since the fever took both their parents, raised her the way one raises an animal one intends to slaughter, with just enough food to keep the breath in the body and never one mouthful more. There had been winters when Mara had eaten the rinds the kitchen scraped for the hounds, and Sereth had watched her do it from the doorway, with an expression that was not quite cruelty and not quite pity, but something colder than either. The look of a woman confirming a thing she had already decided. And now, with the debts of the house mounting and a new alpha to impress, Sereth had found the cleanest solution. Sell the girl, be rid of the burden, smile while the gavel fell. Mara had stopped expecting kindness from her aunt long ago, but there was still a small cold place in her chest that registered the betrayal anew, each time like pressing a bruise to see if it still hurt. It did, it always did. She had learned that the heart does not callous the way the hands do. The hands grew hard and stopped feeling the rough work. The heart only learned to keep its bleeding quiet. The scent of the feast reached her then, roasted meat and spiced wine and warm bread torn open at the long tables behind the crowd, and her empty stomach clenched so violently that her knees nearly buckled. She locked them. She would not fall. To fall was to give them the spectacle they had half come for, the collapse of the wolfless thing, and she would die before she gave them that. So she stood, and she breathed through her mouth so the smell of the food could not reach so deep, and she counted the wax drops, and she held. The bidding opened, and it was not bidding so much as mockery. A merchant offered a single copper coin, and the hall roared. 1 copper, the auctioneer repeated, delighted by the cruelty of it. 1 copper for a girl with no wolf in her and no use to anyone withstanding. Mara felt the heat climb her throat, the shame of it, the sheer reductive horror of being measured against the value of a single dull coin, and found, wanting even of that. She kept her eyes on the chip in the sconce. She breathed. She thought of nothing. She had become very good at thinking of nothing, and then the hall went silent. It happened the way a candle goes out, all at once. The noise simply gone. Mara felt it before she understood it. A change in the air pressure, a shift in the weight of the room. Every wolf in the hall had gone still, their heads turning toward the great doors at the far end, and a low sound moved through them. Not quite a growl, more like the held breath before a growl. Mara looked, because everyone looked, and she saw him. He filled the doorway. That was the first impression. The wrongness of his scale against the frame meant for ordinary men. He wore black, no ornament, no crest, no mark of rank, and he needed none, because the rank came off him like heat off a forge. The lords nearest the door sank to one knee without being told. Aunt Sereth's satisfied smile collapsed into something pale and scrambling, and the auctioneer, who had been so very clever a moment ago, found that his wet hinge voice had abandoned him entirely. The Alpha King had come to the Western auction, and no one had expected him, and no one knew why. He crossed the hall slowly. He did not look at the lords who knelt. He did not look at Sereth, who had begun to curtsy so low she nearly folded. He looked at Mara. His eyes were a strange pale gold, the gold of a winter moon. And when they found her, she felt it as a physical pressure. A hand laid flat against her sternum, and something deep in her body that has been asleep her entire life turned over once in its sleep and began, very slowly, to wake. She did not have a name for the heat that bloomed under her skin then. It started at the back of her neck and spread down her spine like warm water poured from above, and she thought, absurdly, that she must be fainting, that the hunger had finally won, and this golden-eyed apparition was the last invention of a dying mind. He stopped at the foot of the platform. He looked up at her, this king before whom the entire Western Reach now knelt, and she looked back down at him because she did not know how to do anything else. And for one long moment the hall did not exist. The auctioneer recovered enough to speak. He stammered out the situation, the wolfless girl, the bid of 1 copper. Surely your majesty had not come for such a trifle. The Alpha King did not turn his head. He reached into the folds of his coat, and he drew out a coin, and he set it on the edge of the platform with a sound that rang in the silence like a struck bell. It was gold, a single gold sovereign, worth more than every soul in that hall save one, more than the house of Vane and all its debts, more than the auctioneer would see in 10 years of selling the unwanted to the indifferent. She is mine. The 2 words fell into the silence and did not echo, because they did not need to. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain. He turned and walked toward the doors, and a beta in gray peeled away from the wall to cut Mara's bindings, and the rope fell from her ruined wrists, and she stood there, swaying on the cold marble, not understanding anything at all, except that the heat had not stopped, that it had grown, that it now lived in her like a second heartbeat, and that the golden-eyed king had paid in gold for a girl worth 1 copper, and had said nothing else. Nothing, as though the saying of it had cost him something he was not prepared to discuss. The carriage that carried her north was black iron and moonstone, and she sat alone inside it because he rode ahead on a horse the color of smoke, and she watched the Western Reach fall away behind her through a window beaded with rain. She did not weep. She had not wept in years. She held her own torn wrists in her lap, and she tried to make sense of the heat that would not leave her, the warmth that intensified whenever the horse ahead slowed, and the king's shape grew nearer through the rain. By the 4th hour she understood that the heat was tied to his nearness, and the understanding frightened her more than the auction had, because it meant the thing waking inside her was not hunger and not fever, but something older, something the world had names for that she had never been permitted to learn. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass and watched the gold coin of memory turn over, in her mind the ring of it on the marble, the silence after. A man did not pay a fortune for a girl worth a copper unless he meant to make a point, or unless he had no choice at all, and she did not know which frightened her more, the calculation or the helplessness, and she did not yet understand that for him there had been no difference between the two. They reached the palace by moonlight. It rose from the forest like a thing grown rather than built, towers of pale stone laced with veins of moonstone that caught the light and held it, glowing faintly silver against the black trees. She was taken not to the servants' quarters as she expected, as every instinct she possessed insisted she must be but up a winding stair to a chamber with a fire already lit and a bed wide enough for 4 of her and a window that looked out over a still dark pool in the heart of the forest. A woman waited there, old, gray-braided, with hands that had clearly worked all their long life and eyes that missed nothing. The old woman, whose name was Bryn, and who served as the royal healer, took one look at Mara's wrists and made a sound low in her throat. She sat the girl down. She brought warm water and clean cloth and a salve that smelled of crushed pine, and she worked in silence for a long while before she spoke. "You do not know what you are." It was not a question. Mara said that she was a wolfless girl from House Vane, an orphan, a servant, nothing. Bryn's mouth curved, not unkindly. She pressed the salve into the raw skin, and she said, "The king does not pay gold for nothing, child. He paid gold because his wolf would not let him do otherwise." And then she would say no more, no matter how Mara pressed, only that the girl should eat the broth cooling on the table and sleep. because the days to come would ask much of her. Mara ate. She had not meant to weep over a bowl of broth, but the warmth of it, the simple animal comfort of being fed when she had been 3 days starving, undid something in her, and she sat in that great strange room and let the tears come for the first time in longer than she could remember. She fell asleep in her clothes atop the wide bed, and she dreamed of golden eyes. He did not come to her for 3 days. She learned the shape of the palace in those days, the way a prisoner learns the shape of a cell, though no door was ever locked against her. She learned that the servants would not meet her eyes, that they whispered when she passed, that the word they whispered was one she did not know, a word in the old tongue that Bryn refused to translate. She learned that there was a child in the palace, a small ragged orphan boy named Tam who haunted the kitchens, and that this boy, who flinched from every adult in the place, followed Mara like a duckling from the first hour he saw her, pressing his small hand into hers and looking up at her with a trust that made her chest ache. She learned that the king's mother lived in the East Tower, a silver-haired matriarch named Vera, who watched everything from her high windows and said little. And she learned on the 3rd evening what the heat meant, because on the 3rd evening the Alpha King came. She was at the window, watching the moon lay a path of light across the still pool, when she felt him before the door opened, the heat surging up her spine in warning, and she turned and he was there, filling the doorway as he had filled the doorway of that terrible hall. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the silence stretched between them taut as a drawn bowstring. He did not come closer. He stood at the threshold as though something held him there against his will, and his pale gold eyes moved over her ruined wrists, now wrapped in clean linen, and a muscle worked in his jaw. "Do you not feel it?" He did not phrase it as a question, because the bond between them had already answered it. She did not pretend to misunderstand. She was hungry and frightened and very tired of being lied to by others and by herself, and so she told him the truth, that she felt a heat she had no name for, that it lived in her and would not leave, that it grew worse when he was near. He closed his eyes briefly, as though her words were both a wound and a relief. He told her then, in his short absolute sentences, what she was to him and what he was to her. The bond, the mate bond. The thing the moon goddess wove between 2 souls before they were ever born. The thing that could not be chosen or refused or reasoned away. She was his fated mate. His wolf had known it the instant her scent reached him across that crowded hall, had nearly torn through his skin to reach her, and he had paid the gold because there had been no other choice his body would permit. She did not believe him. She wanted to, which frightened her more than disbelief would have. She told him that she was wolfless, that she had no wolf, that the goddess did not weave bonds for girls who had been deemed worth 1 copper coin. And the king looked at her with something almost like grief, and he said, "You are not wolfless. You are bound. There is a difference, and it has been done to you, and I mean to undo it." He told her that he had felt the wrongness of it the moment her scent reached him, a scent like the moon on cold water buried beneath layers of old cruel magic, a thing caged and screaming to be let out, and that his wolf had recognized the cage for what it was even before the man understood what stood behind it. Then he turned and left, and the heat went with him, leaving her cold and shaking by the moonlit window. And she stood there a long while after the door closed, her hand pressed to the place on her sternum where his pale gold eyes had seemed to rest, feeling the caged thing inside her stir for the first time in answer to a key it had waited its whole life to feel turn. The days that followed were the slow building of an unlikely thing. He came each evening. He never crossed the threshold uninvited, never reached for her, never asked for anything she was not prepared to give. And this restraint, in a man before whom kingdoms knelt, undid her more thoroughly than any pursuit could have. He brought her food himself sometimes, which a king should never do, setting the plate on the table and standing by the fire while she ate, watching her with those winter moon eyes as though the simple fact of her eating gave him a peace he could find nowhere else. He spoke little. When he spoke, it was in declarations, in observations that carried weight. "You are stronger than they made you believe," he said at once, low, watching her cross the room, and did not repeat it. Another evening, when she flinched at a sudden sound, his voice came quiet and absolute. "No one will touch you here." The certainty in it was a wall she could lean against. She began to wait for the evenings. She hated that she waited for them. She had spent her whole life learning that wanting things was a way to be hurt, that the safest posture was to expect nothing. And now she found herself standing at the window before sundown, with the heat already gathering at the base of her spine. And she despised her own hope even as she could not extinguish it. There was one evening she would carry with her always. A storm had come down off the mountains, and the fire had guttered, and she had been cold. The old cold of the servants' winters, living in her bones the way such cold does. And he had come and found her shivering at the hearth, and had said nothing at all. He had simply built the fire up with his own hands, a king kneeling at a grate, and then he had taken the heavy fur from his own shoulders and laid it across hers. And the warmth of it had carried his scent, pine and cold stone, and something underneath that was only him. And the heat of the bond had risen to meet it, until she was warmer than she had been in 19 years. He had stayed by the fire the whole night through, not speaking, not reaching, only there, a dark certain shape between her and the dark, and she had fallen asleep in the chair, wrapped in his fur, with storm beating itself out against the moonstone walls. And when she woke, he was gone, and the fire was still high, and she understood that he had tended it through the night so that she would not wake cold. No one in her life had ever kept a fire burning for her sake. She did not have words for what that did to the careful walls she had built. She only knew that something behind them shifted, and did not shift back. Bryn told her pieces of the truth in pieces. The girl's mother, the healer revealed one gray afternoon over a basin of herbs, had not been a servant. She had been a daughter of the old bloodline, the lunar line, the line from which true lunas were born once in 100 years. And she had run from that birthright into a forbidden union and a quiet death. And her sister, who had wanted that birthright for herself, and could never have it, had taken the orphaned child and bound her power at the root, deep with old and cruel magic, so that the wolf inside Mara could never wake and never be recognized and never threaten the place Sereth had carved out for herself. Wolfless, the world called such a girl. Bound, said those few who knew the truth and dared not speak it. Sereth had not sold a worthless servant for 1 copper. She had tried to dispose of a true Luna for the price of a coin, before anyone could smell what she truly was. Mara did not want it to be true. The wanting and the not wanting tore at her in equal measure. But she could not deny the heat, and she could not deny the way the child Tam pressed his face into her side and breathed her in as though she were the only safe thing in the world. And she could not deny the dreams which had grown teeth and fur, and a great silver shape that ran through moonlit forests calling a name that was almost her own. The reveal, when it came as such reveals do, through the spite of the one who had hidden the truth. Sereth came to the palace. She came under the banner of the Western lords for the mating ball, the great gathering at which the Alpha King would, by ancient law, be required to present his chosen mate to the assembled packs, or forfeit the legitimacy of the claim. Sereth had not expected the wolfless niece she had sold to be the mate in question. She learned it in the grand ballroom, beneath the great chandelier in front of the entire court, and the learning broke something in her. She accused Mara before them all. She rose in her dried blood gown, and she pointed a trembling jeweled finger. And she said that the girl was a fraud, a wolfless impostor, that she herself had raised the creature and knew it had no wolf, no bloodline, nothing, that the Alpha King had been deceived by a clever servant, who had insinuated herself into his bed. The hall murmured. The councilors leaned forward. And the secondary danger Mara had not understood until that moment took its shape. A tall, cold lord of the High Council named Draven, who had long opposed the king, and who now saw in this accusation a lever with which to topple a claim he hated. He took up Sereth's words. He demanded proof. He invoked the old law that a mate unproven was a mate denied, that a wolfless girl could not be Luna, that the king must set her aside or be challenged for the throne. The Alpha King rose from the black iron throne, and the room went silent as a held breath. He looked at Sereth, and he looked at Draven, and then he looked at Mara, who stood at the center of the gathered court in a gown of pale silver Vera had sent her, trembling, exposed, every old shame of the auction block rushing back, and the heat between them flared so violently that several wolves nearest her stepped back, their nostrils flaring, because they smelled it now, the thing Sereth's binding had hidden for 19 years. The thing that had begun to leak through the cracked seams of an old magic worn thin by proximity to its fated other. I can smell the lie on your breath. The king said it to Sereth across the whole length of the silent hall, and his wolf was in his voice. And the woman in the dried blood gown went the color of old ash. He did not need to raise it. The truth of it moved through the gathered court like a cold draft, and the lords who had leaned toward Draven a moment before now leaned away. Then he descended from the throne, and he crossed the floor, and he stood before Mara, and he asked her one quiet question that the whole hall strained to hear. Will you let me undo it? She did not understand what he meant to do, but she had stood at the center of cruel rooms her whole life, and been the object of decisions made about her, and never once been asked. And the simple fact of the asking decided her. She said yes. What followed she would never be able to describe to anyone, not even to herself in the quiet years that came after. He took her hand, and the heat became fire, real fire, fire that did not burn but transformed, racing up her arm and into her chest, and down into the deep-bound root of her, where Sereth's cruel old magic had coiled like a sleeping serpent for 19 years. The king's wolf rose into his eyes, fully the gold blazing, and Mara felt his power pour into the bond and strike the binding like a hammer striking ice. It cracked. She heard it crack. A sound inside her bones, and pain came, white and total, and she would have fallen, but he held her, his arms a certainty around her, his voice low at her ear saying, I have you, I have you. Again and again the only words he had to give, and the only ones that mattered. The binding shattered, and the wolf that had been bound inside her for 19 years woke all at once, vast and silver and ancient, and it surged up through her like a tide breaking, and the heat that had frightened her became hers, her own power, her own self, the thing that had always been there beneath the starvation and the cruelty and the single copper coin. For the length of one heartbeat she stood at the center of her own life, and felt for the first time that it belonged to her. The hunger, the cold winters, the rinds scraped for the hounds, the chip in the black iron sconce she had stared at to keep from screaming, all of it fell away beneath the rising tide of what she truly was, and she understood that nothing had been taken from her that the goddess had not been keeping safe until she was strong enough to hold it. Silver light poured off her skin. The whole court saw it. The whole court smelled it, the unmistakable scent of the lunar line, of a true Luna, the first in 100 years, standing in a pale silver gown at the center of the throne room, with the light of the moon itself rising off her like steam. Wolves dropped to their knees throughout the hall, not commanded, unable to do otherwise in the presence of what she was. Draven went white, and Sereth, who had sold this for 1 copper coin, made a sound like a creature stepping into a trap it had set itself, and began to back away. But power newly woken is not power mastered, and the binding shattering had torn something open that should not have been torn. And that was the moment the threat that had been gathering at the edges of the kingdom chose to strike. The Hollow Ones came. They were shadow-given hunger, old enemies of the lunar line, drawn to the surge of unbound power like sharks to blood and water, and they poured through the great windows of the ballroom in a tide of cold and dark, and the screaming began, and the ball became a battlefield. Mara stood at the eye of it, half undone, her new power roaring through her in waves she could not yet control. The king became something terrible to behold, his wolf rising into his full shape, vast and dark, throwing himself between the shadow things and his mate, his Luna, snarling commands to the betas, holding the line. But there were too many. The cold of the Hollow Ones drank the warmth from the room, from the bond, and Mara felt the heat that had become her lifeline guttering like a candle in wind. She understood, with the clarity that comes only in such moments, that the bond was incomplete, that the binding shattering had woken her power but not anchored it, that without the mark, the bite that completed the mate bond, she would burn through her own newly woken strength, and the hollow ones would take her. And the king knew it too. He came to her through the chaos. There was blood on him, dark and steaming. He took her face in his hands. This king before whom she had once stood worth 1 copper coin, and he looked at her with the whole of himself laid bare for the first time. No command in it, no certainty, only a question and a fear. He told her what the mark would do. He told her it could not be taken, only given, that the law of the bond required her consent as the law of his honor required nothing less, that even now, with the shadow closing in and death in the room, he would not take what she did not freely offer. I am trying to give you time. He gave the words to her the way he gave everything, plainly and at cost, the same restraint that had undone her in the quiet evenings, holding even here at the edge of the dark. There was no time. She knew it, and he knew it. And so she did the bravest thing she had ever done, braver than enduring the auction, braver than surviving 19 years of careful starvation. She chose. She pulled him down to her, and she bared her throat to him, the ancient gesture of offered trust, and she said the words, "Say it again." He had told her once weeks ago of something small. She said the only thing that mattered, "Now I am yours, mark me." His mouth found the curve of her neck, and his teeth broke the skin, and the pain came as Bryn had once half warned her it might, sharp and total, a white line drawn through the center of her. And then it transformed, the way the binding's fire had transformed, the pain becoming light, becoming heat, becoming completion, the bond slamming shut around them both, like two halves of a thing that had been broken since before either of them was born. She felt him then, all of him, the way the bond was meant to be felt, the iron control, and the grief beneath it, and the vast, terrified tenderness he had carried alone. For the weeks she had kept him at her threshold, all of it pouring across the bond into her at once, and she understood that the cold, untouchable king had been just as frightened as she was, just as starved in his own way, for she was the first thing in all his life of command that he had wanted and could not simply take. And her power, which had been guttering, roared back tenfold, anchored now, hers and his and theirs, the lunar line and the alpha line woven into one, and the silver light that poured off her became a thing that could be wielded. She turned to face the hollow ones, and she was not afraid. What she did to them, the court would tell their grandchildren of, in voices hushed with the telling. The silver light became a tide of its own, the moon's own answer to the hungry dark, and it swept through the ballroom, and the hollow ones came apart before it, like frost before sunrise. Shrieking, unmaking, gone, the cold lifted, the warmth returned, and in the sudden ringing silence of the saved hall, the true Luna stood at her mate's side, marked and complete and blazing, and not one soul in that gathered court would ever again call her wolfless, or worth the price of a single dull coin. Draven knelt. He had no choice and he knew it. A challenge against the king had been folly. A challenge against the king and a fully woken true Luna, who had just unmade the hollow ones with her bare will, was suicide. And Draven was cruel, but he was not stupid, and he sank to his knee and pressed his forehead to the cold floor and renounced his claim before the assembled lords, and the institutional cruelty he represented broke against the simple fact of what Mara had become and Sereth. Sereth had tried to flee in the chaos, and the Betas had taken her, and now she was brought before the throne where Mara stood. The king would have had her killed. Mara saw it in the set of his shoulders, the way his wolf still moved beneath his skin, hungry for the throat of the one who had starved and bound and sold his mate. But Mara stayed his hand. She looked at her aunt, this woman who had pressed a bruise into her for 19 years, and she found, to her own surprise, that she did not want the woman's death. She wanted something Sereth would find far worse. She stripped her of the house of Vane, of her rank, of her standing, and she sentenced her to live out her days in the very servants' quarters she had condemned her niece to. wolfless now herself in every way that the world counted, watching from the bottom of the hierarchy she had killed to climb. Quiet dignity, Mara had once thought, was the only thing the woman could not sell. She let Sereth keep her life and take from her everything else, and the mercy of it was its own kind of justice, and it was the choice of a Luna and not a victim. The seasons turned. The kingdom settled into the strangeness of its new truth, and then ceased to find it strange at all, the way the world does. Mara learned her power as one learns a language, slowly then, all at once. Bryn taught her the old ways of the lunar line, the things Sereth had tried to erase. Vera, the king's silver-haired mother, came down from her east tower and took Mara's hands in hers and called her daughter. And the approval of that observant matriarch settled over the new Luna like a mantle, the last social seal on a status now permanently inverted. The child Tam was given a place in the household and a future, and he followed Mara still. Less a duckling now, and more a small shadow learning to stand in the light. And when people asked how the boy had known that very first day what the girl truly was, the answer was always the same. The young see clearly. The innocent smell the truth before the proud will allow themselves to. And the king, the cold, untouchable king before whom the Western Reach had knelt, who had paid gold for a copper girl and said nothing, found in the quiet years that came after that he had a great deal to say. After all, in the dark, in the moonlight that came through the high windows of their chamber, in the low private voice he used for no one else in all the realm, he told her of the hall, of the instant her scent had reached him, of how his wolf had nearly broken its bones to reach her, and how he had walked across that crowded floor not knowing what he would find, only that he could not do otherwise. He told her that the gold had been the easiest thing he had ever spent, and the saying of those two words, "She is mine," the hardest, because in the saying he had given himself away entirely to a girl in chains, who did not yet know what she was. "You will not touch her." He had wanted to roar at the whole hall. He had said only what the law required and let the rest live in his eyes. She would lay her head against the steady drum of his heart and feel the heat that had once frightened her. The heat she now understood was simply the shape his love took when it could not find words. And she would think of the chip in the black iron sconce she had stared at to keep from screaming, and of the single copper coin, and of how the lowest thing in that cruel hall had become the highest in all the realm. She did not think of it with bitterness. The bitterness had burned away in the silver fire of her waking. She thought of it the way one thinks of a long winter survived, with a kind of fierce tenderness for the girl who had endured it, who had kept her quiet dignity when it was the only thing left, who had said yes when she was finally, for the first time in her life, asked. On the last night of the first full year of her reign, Mara stood at the window of the high chamber and looked down at the still dark pool in the heart of the forest, the moon laying its path of light across the black water as it had on the night she first arrived. Frightened and starving and wrapped in stolen linen, she thought of the girl who had stood on that auction block counting wax drops to keep from screaming, and she did not pity her. For that girl had carried her through to this window, this light, this life, and she owed her too much for pity. She owed her instead the keeping of every promise the king's gold had made in that cruel silent hall. The king came to stand behind her, and the heat rose up her spine in greeting, no warning in it now, only welcome. He did not speak. He had learned from her the weight a silence could carry. She leaned back into the certainty of him, into the arms that had held her while the binding shattered, the arms that had been a wall she could lean against from the very first, and she watched the moon on the water and felt the bond hum between them, complete, unbreakable, faded before either of them drew breath. They had auctioned the servant girl for 1 copper coin. The Alpha King had paid in gold and said nothing, and neither of them, on that terrible night in that cruel hall, could have known that the silence between them was not the silence of nothing being said, but the silence of two halves of one soul recognizing each other at last, and finding that there were no words yet made that could hold the size of it. There would be time for the words in the moonlit years to come. For now there was only the heat and the bond, and the moon on the still water, and the Luna who had once been worth 1 copper coin standing in the light she had been born to, and finally fully come home.